developments in the data ecosystem. Next slide. And so what I hope to do is to really reflect on kind of the position that we've stated out a few months ago, that I'm going to mute a few, the position that we stated out a few months ago, that we may enter a data winter, by which we mean that what was typically open in the past might have become more closed, and that we also see kind of a backlash with regard to having data made open for public interest purposes. And so what I hope to do in the first part is to really actually challenge the issue whether we are entering a data winter, because of course, as you can see in this early blog that I wrote, it was a question mark. And so we still have to actually see whether this is gonna turn into a full-blown data winter, which by the way may, of course, impact the AI summer, or whether we see trends that are actually more on the positive side. And so today, I hope to actually share a little bit more of the positive side of what's happening in the data ecosystem. Next slide. And the first kind of indication and exhibit of the fact that this might be more open is, of course, what's happening also in kind of social media. Some of you might have seen that as a result of a variety of trends, including the US presidential election, we actually have seen a massive migration from what was in the past called Twitter, now X, to kind of alternative social media platforms. And one alternative media platform that has emerged and that has become very popular, especially here among US-based academics, is Blue Sky. And Blue Sky is kind of a non-profit-owned social media platform, which surprisingly, actually, if you go to Blue Sky, looks a lot like Twitter in terms of functionalities and in terms of how you can actually start using it. It also has a few additional features, such as, for instance, you can actually determine kind of algorithmic diversification. And you can also, to a large extent, start anyway determining how you want to share some of your content as well. Now, this is kind of anyway interesting from a social media perspective, but from my perspective, from a data stewardship perspective, it's more interesting, of course, to what extent actually Blue Sky can become the new kind of social media platform that can be used for instance, computational social science to understand trends and to understand sentiment analysis as it relates to particular topics. Because the real challenge from a data winter was, of course, that X, but then also Reddit, and then more recently also Meta, of course, have basically closed their APIs in order to APIs to researchers and to public interest organizations, including to data journalists, so that it became very hard to actually make sense of what's happening in social media in terms of disinformation, in terms of network science, and so on. And so what could be interesting as we see this migration from traditional social media platforms to Blue Sky, and of course, we do have to acknowledge that Blue Sky is not the only alternative social media platform. We've seen Thread, we've seen Mastodon, for instance, emerge as well. But it suffices to say is that Blue Sky is kind of the most aligned with Twitter. As I said, it actually looks and it feels like Twitter to a large extent. But more interesting is that Blue Sky also has actually, or it appears to have an open API to its content, which to a large extent could kind of reintroduce the use of social media data for kind of sentiment analysis. It could reintroduce the use of social media for computational social science. And so that's kind of the first kind of development I wanted to raise. And it would be interesting, anyway, at the end of this session to hear your reactions, whether you feel that this is, anyway, kind of a positive development. But it's, again, suffice to say is that an alternative to Twitter, especially when you can actually also start accessing some of the data for research on disinformation, misinformation, it might be a positive trend, and it might deal with this kind of post-API kind of environment that alerted the arrival of the data winter. Next slide. The other development, and this is for those who are working in kind of the geospatial environment, that is kind of positive, is kind of the arrival of certain open source and open data as it relates to geospatial location data. And so the first one here is kind of the Foursquare Open Source Place, which provides access to data that involves points of interest. And it is interesting to see that we've seen this kind of open data as it relates to geospatial data, as it relates to point of interest growing as well. And the other example that I put here is kind of a interesting example on the emergence of open data as it relates to geospatial data is kind of the Overture Maps Foundation, who also has a commitment to actually work together with OpenStreetMap to make geolocation data more open. It doesn't position itself as competition to OpenStreetMap, but as kind of a complementary kind of open data set that could be of interest as well. And I know there are some people on the call today from, of course, OpenStreetMap, and it would be interesting to see how that anyway can be seen as a contribution or can be seen as kind of more a diversion as well. Now, it suffice to say is that mapping data should in essence be kind of a common infrastructure as opposed to kind of infrastructures that are seek to compete with each other, meaning, but of course, as we all know, Google Maps, Apple Maps, and so on are all trying to basically take a piece of the market share. And as a result, we see this kind of competition among those big players for geolocation data, which also creates this kind of fragmentation of mapping data as opposed to kind of a common infrastructure that everyone can leverage as well. Next slide. The other development that is worth noting is, of course, that in part because, of course, it was much harder to use an API, and because there is this amazing hunger for accessing data, such as, for instance, accessing data for training purposes of AI. Some might have called this the arrival of the Great Scrape. And this is kind of the title that I put there from a pretty interesting paper that was recently over the summer released by Daniel Solow and Woodrow Hartsock, both academics that have made their name in the privacy community. And basically their argument was that we are seeing a massive increase in scraping data. And of course, there are a few companies that basically have made their name in the scraping environment or in the crawl environment. Of course, everyone probably knows as it relates to data for training purposes, everyone knows Common Crawl. But there is another actor such as Bright Data that also basically scrapes the open internet in order to then provide access to that data for a variety of purposes, of course, commercial purposes, but also through, for instance, their Bright initiative. They also make that kind of public data of the internet, public web data, as they call it, available for data for good initiatives. And for those who are interested, I do recommend checking out the Bright initiative, because you could also seek whether that might be, anyway, generate some kind of collaboration as well. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that Meta, for instance, filed a court case against Bright Data because they felt that Bright Data was basically scraping data in a way that was illegal. And of course, anyway, if they would have won, that basically would probably have meant the end of the scraping industry, or also the end of actually scraping data in general. And so what was interesting is that Bright Data actually won the case, which also opens the kind of the door for scraping as such. And they won the case on a variety of cases, such as, for instance, the fact that the argument was that they basically sidestepped CAPTCHA, because, of course, what is the open web? The open web is any data you can basically access that has no barrier for access. Now, typically a barrier for access is, for instance, that you have to type in your username and your password. Well, that's obviously not open data anymore, or open web, public web data anymore. The question here was that is CAPTCHA, which many of you, of course, have encountered on a daily basis, is CAPTCHA actually, if you sidestep CAPTCHA, does this also mean that you actually scrape private data? And the case here was that CAPTCHA is not seen as kind of a barrier to public web data. There's just, anyway, a way to slow down access to data, not to close data. And that was kind of an important court case. Now, they have now also created something called the Alliance for Responsible Data Collection, which is basically the Alliance for Responsible Data Scraping, which is kind of an interesting development. And here I've also copy and pasted kind of the guidelines that they have developed for their members. And the members include, for instance, also CrowdTangle, which Common Crawl, sorry, which includes, of course, which is kind of one of the main places to get open web data for AI training purposes as well. And so that's kind of another development in the data ecosystem as it relates to data scraping, and whether actually data scraping can be seen as kind of open data, and of course, to what extent this is kind of responsible, because the argument that Daniel Soloff and Woodrow Hartzog were making is, of course, that a lot of the scraping practices actually cannot be aligned with privacy practices as well. And so the question is, of course, how do you do this in a responsible way? But at the same time, how do you actually canvas the open and public web for public interest purposes? I think that's kind of an interesting question and an interesting development to keep an eye on as well. Next slide. Then what is happening as well, and that's kind of a trend that has just been accelerated, mainly again because of the need for more data, and especially the need for more data for funneling AI applications, or for instance, funneling kind of digital twin kind of environments is the increase in what some may call connected data that is being collected through connected devices. And this is just a recent report that was released by the National Academies Press, so in the US, where they basically, anyway, try to assess what new data sources can be used for active traffic management. Now, of course, if you have those data sources, you can also use it for other purposes that involve a timestamp and a geolocation aspect. And I just wanted to share kind of the new data sources that they have identified, and that is becoming more and more used for actually active traffic management within the public sector, such as, for instance, connected travelers, which is, of course, anyway, data that could be both crowdsourced data, such as Waze, for instance, but also data that is being collected through connected devices that are proxies of individuals. And so based upon that, you can actually understand travel speeds. You can already see this in the maps, of course, that is being reflected. Anyway, if you're in traffic jam, that is, of course, all extrapolated from this kind of connected travelers data. Then you have connected vehicles, which is kind of interesting, or CVs as they're called, vehicles that are increasingly capable of communicating with other vehicles, so that you can actually know what's the distance between the vehicles. And if the distance is very small, then you actually know that they are kind of in traffic jam. But also more and more vehicle to, for instance, bicycle, right? So it's not just vehicle to vehicle anymore. You actually also have more and more connected bicycles, or even connected pedestrians that, of course, also have a connected device, such as, for instance, your smartphone, that can actually start communicating with the vehicles and indicating how close you are, and so on and so on. And then they have other emerging data sources, which is, of course, smart infrastructure as well, that becomes more important as kind of new data sources. And so again, if we start thinking about non-traditional data, and how do we start using non-traditional data for public interest purposes, and how do we steward that? I think it's important to also take into account those connected devices. Now, interestingly, is that all the big players, right, the Googles, the Microsofts, the Apples of the world, they all are entering the connected device field. And it's going to be interesting to keep an eye on the emergence of new connected devices, mainly because there's this amazing hunger, of course, for data. And they have, as mentioned last time, and also was mentioned in the data winter development, they actually have reached a certain kind of data scarcity because they basically used all the data they could get. And that's also why there's a lot of investment in new kind of connected devices that provide new data sources in order to do the training, but also in order to understand, for instance, active behavior, right? And so this is kind of an interesting report if you're interested to check out how those new kind of devices will also inform public interest and public sector management of traffic as well. Next slide. And then what is interesting is also the emergence of actually the use of AI, of course, for humanitarian purposes. And we see actually also new methods emerging, especially new methods as it relates to forecast and foresight. And so this is, for instance, one example where the UN, in this case UNDP, together with the folks that are managing security and peace within the UN, the peace building sector of the UN, are starting to use AI to actually develop kind of foresight scenarios. And it would be interesting if you go to that blog, there you will find kind of a lot of examples on how AI was used to actually do some kind of tabletop exercises where they actually introduced kind of scenarios that were, anyway, basically presented in videos to introduce a scenario that then, anyway, people could react to as well. And that also relates to the kind of the use of AI and data to advance forecasting and foresight, where you can actually now, anyway, you don't have to have a scenario that is kind of static. You can actually build, anyway, very rapidly a video that almost, anyway, gets you into the situation by basically simulation as well. And then the other document I list here is a document that we will release this week, which is kind of an overview of new forecasting and foresight methods that can be used for migration as well. And the big message here is that everyone is moving, or at least, anyway, the innovation is moving towards mixed methods where forecast and foresight are being merged, right? Because typically you had this kind of distinction between forecast, which was more quantitative, and foresight, which was more qualitative, kind of, anyway, scenario planning and so on. But what we see is that the real innovation is actually at the intersection of both forecast and foresight, which then gets the kind of the title of anticipation, and because it's both quantitative and qualitative. And so we see a lot of innovation in kind of the anticipation field. And I thought it would be interesting for data stewards to also be aware that this is happening, but also thinking about, anyway, how can you start using actually AI to improve the experience of scenario building and so on as well. Next slide. And then staying in the humanitarian space, there are also an increased amount of examples on how AI is being used to, for instance, extract learnings that then can be translated into the field. And this is one of the dashboards that the Red Cross, International Federation of Red Cross, has developed, which I think is kind of an early indication of what can happen if you start using large language models for extracting, for instance, best practices. And so what they have done here is they basically collected all the kinds of case studies on how they responded to crises in the past. And then based upon kind of a large language model, you can now start basically extracting lessons learned. So what should you do if you're in the context that is similar to a previous context that has already been, of course, experienced in the past as it relates to crisis management? And I think this is super interesting because it also might really make humanitarian interventions more evidence-based. It might be based upon kind of lessons learned from previous crises, which typically, anyway, was present because there were quite often the same people, but there was quite often a challenge in actually knowledge sharing, and this can be done now through, for instance, generative AI, where you actually extract some of those lessons and start sharing it at mass. Next slide. Then the other example that we see staying in the environment is kind of a new report that was released by the European Union on unlocking the Green Deal data. As you know, the Green Deal has been a priority for the European Commission for a long time. And of course, this is also very relevant for anyone who is interested and worked on climate change and environmental data for environmental management. But in that report, they basically go into a whole range of kind of new approaches for data governance. And one, surprise, surprise, is data stewardship. So if you're interested in how you go about data stewardship within the context of environmental data, this might be a good report to read, and where they also are referring to data altruism. And so data altruism, for those who have followed the kind of European debate, is kind of a new method that has been made available through the Data Governance Act, where you can actually register for to become a data altruistic organization. So far, there's only one that has registered based in Barcelona, mainly because the Data Governance Act actually requires the creation of national registration bodies that would actually review the applications and then register the organizations, such as data intermediaries or data altruistic organizations. And many European countries have not set that system up, which means that, of course, the implementation of the Data Governance Act has been fairly slow because of the absence of kind of the national implementation of the legislation as well. But anyway, this is kind of an interesting new report that goes into data stewardship for the Green Deal. And of course, next slide, there was also other efforts. This is kind of one article that we've been writing in order to how do you actually use data stewardship to advance climate science. And this was published at the same time. And of course, COP29 is still underway anyway, we can argue to what extent this will actually be a breakthrough. But of course, it's important to start thinking about how do you actually set up data commons to advance climate science to really make a difference as it relates to climate. Next slide. And how do you also start using data for instance, responding better and anticipating better climate-induced crises, such as, for instance, the, of course, flooding that took place in Valencia. And this is another article that we published where we went into kind of detail, where we try to reflect on what are the elements that need to be in place, both at the level of first mile, last mile, but then also the key element is, of course, how do you actually make sense from the data and how do you provide a signal in the noise? And I think that was kind of the big lesson from Valencia. Data was there, but it was not shared rapidly enough. And of course, it was also not acted upon in a way that could have prevented some of the fatalities that took place during the flooding as well. Next slide. So these are all kind of indications on an emerging trends within the kind of data ecosystem, where we see, anyway, positive trends as it relates to new kind of data sources being developed, but also new kind of data sources being made open, such as, for instance, geolocation kind of data as well. Now, the other element I would like to briefly reflect on is then kind of the emerging controversies, or I could not call it perhaps controversies, but at least tensions that we see in the data stewardship kind of environment. And the first tension, next slide, relates to this whole issue of data sovereignty. There is not a single day that passes where there is some panel or there is some conversation about data or digital sovereignty. And for instance, and especially, of course, as it relates to AI, the picture in the middle is kind of where NVIDIA is working together with Denmark in order to basically anyway, have a sovereign AI approach to access to, for instance, CPU, access to computational power, so that Denmark can be in the lead or even independent when it comes to access to computational power. And anyway, I mean, when they saw Denmark was doing that, I can assure you that every country almost, anyway, started thinking about how can we get the same deal. And this is kind of the constant discussion now, is that, anyway, how do we become sovereign as it relates to AI, as it relates to data, or as it relates to digital? And of course, quite often this is also connected with then the whole discussion about digital public infrastructure and the need to have alternatives to kind of what is generally seen as big tech as well. Now, the interesting thing is that finally we're getting a little bit more of a sophisticated debate about, anyway, the traps of digital and AI sovereignty. Is that it's not just, anyway, always good, and also coming up with some alternatives as well. And this is an article by Akash Kapoor, who basically, anyway, goes into detail about some of the traps, such as increased fragmentation. If everyone starts developing their own infrastructure or kind of creates walls, then we will have a more fragmented environment. And we also see, of course, already massive internet fragmentation as well. But we also will see an increased centralization of some of the decision-making as it relates to data and AI, which in itself, of course, might lead to kind of digital authoritarianism. Because it's interesting that kind of some of the governments that have jumped on the data and AI sovereignty are not always the most democratic governments, because they clearly want to control quite often the infrastructure and then also, of course, the content as such. And so that in itself could be a trap. And of course, not everyone can actually stand on their own legs when it comes to AI and when it comes to digital. And so the question here is, of course, whether this kind of digital and AI and data sovereignty trend actually is going to harm the smaller countries more, because they're going to have to catch up, or they're not going to have access to certain kinds of services and infrastructures that then the ones that are sovereign have as well. And so we need to have a better conversation about the pros and cons. Obviously, I totally, and anyway, understand the need for thinking about decreasing dependencies, which is quite often the rationale for thinking about, for instance, in Europe, a Euro stack. But at the same time, we also have to start thinking about the possible implications of following that pathway as well, which is why the article of Akash is that, and what we, anyway, at GovLab and at the Data Tank have been working on, is actually really focusing on digital self-determination as opposed to digital sovereignty, which is different in the sense is that sovereignty is really about imposing authority, trying to prevent dependencies, where digital self-determination is really about enabling agency, and also agency at the level of communities. Because the other concern I have with kind of the data sovereignty or AI sovereignty is that quite often communities are not part of actually the conversation about what sovereignty looks like and how then AI is being used for what purposes. And so digital self-determination, where you actually acquire a social license for the applications and for identifying particular kind of use cases, might be a preferred way if you really want to deal with the agency asymmetries that we have, not just the AI and infrastructure asymmetries, but also the agency asymmetries as well. So that's kind of one controversy. And again, it's as typically, of course, it's not either or, right? In most cases, you probably need and sovereignty and self-determination, but one without the other. Anyway, we need to start thinking about how is that feasible, and is this actually a positive development as well? Next slide. The other, and as it relates to sovereignty, by the way, of course, a key element in data sovereignty is, of course, sovereignty as it relates to particular communities, which is where actually self-determination and sovereignty kind of merge more profoundly. And so this is kind of a trend as it relates to kind of indigenous data, but in this context, indigenous biodata, because as you know, meaning the other big revolution is, of course, in addition to AI, is of course in biotechnology. And of course, in order to support the current kind of transition in biotechnology, where anyway AI, by the way, is used in order to make advances as it relates to biotechnology, the key requirement is actually to have access to biodata. And it turns out a lot of the biodata is, of course, extracted from communities that have years of traditional knowledge on how certain plants, certain biological artifacts can be used for instance, medical purposes. And of course, there is never a return to those communities. And so what was discussed recently, which was also kind of the article of the Financial Times, is whether there should be the creation of a biodata fund that actually would support indigenous communities in how their biodata is being used as well. Now, in order to manage the biodata, you then need biodata infrastructures. And there's also the other recent article that I pushed there was in Bioscience, where there was kind of a whole review, is that there are international biodata infrastructures, but actually we need to move that more and more to the national and even at the local level, because anyway, to really manage diversity in a way that that is relevant. Next slide. Now, the other controversy, and again, I go quick because I do want to get all your input as well and reactions, is of course the controversy with regard to the environmental impact of AI and data centers. That's going to become even more pronounced moving forward. I just list there two papers that was recently released by the OECD. One was kind of the digital economy outlook, and the other one was kind of a revision, or at least a review of the recommendations that were made with regard to ICT and the environment, where they anyway make the reflection that they're going to have to update this because no one really anticipated the environmental impact of data centers, which quite often use more electricity than certain nation states. And so how do you manage that in terms of both energy security, but also in terms of course, the environmental impact, while at the same time, of course, AI can also be used to actually make energy use more efficient. And so you have this controversy between AI is good versus AI is bad for climate change as well. And this is going to become even more pronounced moving forward. And it's going to be interesting to see how that actually informs data stewardship. Because from my point of view, environmental stewardship and data stewardship are going to have to become more and more aligned. And my view is also that reusing data is environmentally more sound than collecting more data, storing more data, and actually using more kind of computational resource as well, and which also translate into, of course, energy consumption as well. And so the issue of environmental stewardship is going to become more and more a key part of data stewardship moving forward from my point of view as well. Next slide. And then the other controversy is, of course, the creation of new data that is AI generated. I mean, on the right side there, you will see if you do a search these days for baby peacocks, then all the ones that are crossed were actually images that were already AI created. And so you see this massive generation of AI created imagery, but also AI created data that becomes much harder to actually know what is actually AI generated and what is not AI generated, right? And then part that deals with some of the data scarcity. At the same time, of course, if it's all AI generated, then the question is, to what extent does it actually still reflect kind of real data, because that's now being called synthetic data. And that might, of course, if you start using that for training purposes, it might lead to model collapse as well. Same problem we see happening in Wikipedia, where a lot of the new entries are actually generated through AI. And of course, then the question is, to what extent is this still a knowledge commons that is being created by individuals, by uh, um, common groups of individuals, Wikipedians that actually have this kind of editorial control and attempt to create something that is of high quality. And so the real challenge, of course, is going to be to manage AI generated content. At the same time, AI could actually be a tool, again, to oversee what data has been created by AI as well. But again, another element from data stewardship is going to be how do you steward newly generated data sources that have been generated through AI? And that's going to become an increasingly important topic and controversy as well. Next slide. So that's kind of data ecosystem, and then the kind of emerging kind of trends that might create some tensions that data stewards need to be aware of. So what are some of the policy developments, very briefly, that we have noticed the last month? Because again, we always try to provide kind of trends that were more recent that might be important to be aware of. The first one, next slide, is really what happened at the international level. This is kind of the first time ever that some principles have been proposed at the international level on how to govern data. And this is the CEB, which stands for the Chief Executives Boards for Coordination, which is basically the board that connects all UN agencies. And again, there are no shortage of UN agencies, connects all UN agencies in order to have common positions as they relate to particular kind of policies or areas. And this is kind of the common position by all UN agencies as it relates to data governance, and specifically as it relates to principles for data governance. And again, it's indicated, it says proposed, because they still want to do kind of public consultation, but it's kind of the first ever global data governance principles that have been proposed. And they are categorized in kind of three buckets. One is about value, which is, again, interesting because this goes beyond kind of data protection, right? Because typically data protection in the past was only focused on protecting data. Here, there was a clear statement that this is actually about creating value from data, and that this should be done, of course, in a responsible way. But it was about maximizing the value of data, enabling data use and reuse, which is where data stewardship, of course, comes in and is also clearly mentioned as kind of a vehicle for achieving that. And then, of course, interoperability. And the second bucket is really about trust, where they, and again, this is the UN, obviously embrace human rights as kind of the vehicle to establish rights as it relates to establishing trust, and then also at the level of data quality and security, which of course goes into the issue of integrity, and also goes back to the issue of how can you make data AI ready as well. And then the last, which I think is the real interesting addition to data governance, because in the past data governance was quite often data protection focused on preventing misuse, but it didn't take into account kind of equity quite often. And so we see this kind of shift in the data governance space where equity becomes a more pronounced principle. And so this is about promoting equity in data governance, but also digital self-determination, where actually digital self-determination now gets recognized at the international level as a principle for global data governance, which I think is a really important development. And then, of course, fairness and non-discrimination. And so it's going to be interesting to see whether those principles are becoming kind of the benchmark for future global data governance, because there's a lot of development there, as you know, as a result of the Global Digital Compact, which now is looking into creating global data governance as the implementation. And it's going to be interesting to see how those principles are now are becoming kind of the benchmark for future governance work as well. Next slide. Then there's also work and a lot of development at the national level. And here I just selected one, which is kind of a new bill that was proposed by the UK government and the UK Parliament, which is called the Data Use and Access Bill, right? It's called DUAL or DUA bill or whatever it's called. And then you have this long title, which basically is kind of interesting to read. But the essence of this bill is that it actually within the UK, and of course, anyway, as a reminder, the UK is not part of the European Union anymore, but within the UK, they try to actually go further than what's happened within the European Union as it relates to data reuse. And so one particular area of the bill focuses on the creation of what is called smart data schemes, which is interesting as which is kind of similar to data spaces perhaps within the European environment or data intermediaries. But basically what it gives the authority to the Science and Technology Secretary to create additional regulation to unlock data for other purposes than initially intended as well. And I think it's going to be super interesting to see how it is going to be used and to what extent, of course, data stewardship, because from my point of view, this should embed data stewardship as kind of the practice to do smart data as well. And we already see that there's a lot of discussion towards that end as well. Next slide. Then the other element that might be worth knowing is that within the US, and again, I apologize for kind of my selection bias in the kind of developments that I have curated here. But interestingly, just this month, there was a new development, a new basically report that was released by the US government on innovating the data ecosystem. And I think interesting is that there were kind of 6 strategies that were proposed. One was actually enhancing the reusability and integrity of data, which is where data stewardship, of course, comes in. And here, it's really about making data ready for AI, which is the other big topic that emerges from all the developments, which is where more and more governments are starting not just to look at open data or reusability of data, but then reusability in the context of AI, which is why, anyway, what we probably will see is kind of an update of the FAIR principles, which, as you all know, typically focus on findability, accessibility, interoperability, reusability. And what we see is kind of a call to expand reusability as it relates to making data AI ready as well. And so if you go to that report, there you will find quite some interesting suggestions on how to do so. And of course, anyway, the focus is on data integrity, it's on kind of data provenance, data lineage, and so on. But I think this is becoming a key topic for data stewardship, which is really about how do you make not data just reusable, but how do you also make data AI ready as well. Next slide. And this is also happening in Europe, where data stewardship is becoming more and more recognized as kind of the connection between the policy infrastructure and the technical infrastructure. For those who are interested, this was kind of the workshop that we held in Brussels, where this got further developed. And again, data stewardship is kind of seen as the human infrastructure needed for kind of the policy infrastructure and the technical infrastructure to be developed. And that also especially applies to the so-called data spaces, where everyone is focusing on a technical connector, but now there's also a recognition they actually need a human connector as well.